Hi, welcome back to educator.com. This is the lesson on the digestive system. Functions of the digestive system include ingestion, the act of physically putting food into your mouth, that's ingesting. Mechanical breakdown starts in the mouth, that's with the teeth, with the tongue. When you swallow food, your stomach does mechanical digestion. That's anytime you're ripping, tearing, crushing food. So that's the physical breakdown. Digestion itself, if we look at like what causes digestion to occur, mechanical breakdown does assist with it, but on a microscopic level, it's the chemical breakdown that really gets it done. That's enzymes, acids, all those molecules that physically break down macromolecules, larger molecules, into the tinier ones that you can absorb into the bloodstream and actually provide your body nourishment. Secretion. Throughout parts of your digestive tract, all the way up in the mouth with saliva, all the way down to the large intestine, you are secreting items. Glands are physically releasing substances, fluids, enzymes, other molecules into your digestive tract to assist with the breakdown and movement of this food through there. Absorption, the opposite of secretion. You're physically absorbing those nourishing molecules, those nutrients, into your bloodstream so that you can stay alive. And excretion, that's releasing waste out the exit hole. The alimentary canal is a fancy way of saying your digestive tract, or your GI tract, gastrointestinal tract. So either of these terms or digestive tract is acceptable. And when we look at this tube from the mouth all the way to the end, all of these are connected to each other. Some parts of it are a little expanded or twisty-turny or really long, but all of these are in sequence. Later on, I'll cover the accessory organs that are off to the side of the tract, like the liver and the pancreas. So of course it starts with the mouth. You swallow food, it goes down the pharynx, right in here, and then into the esophagus. If it goes down into the larynx trachea, you have a problem, and you could be choking or aspirating, and that's no good. Once food and liquids go down the esophagus, they enter the stomach. From the stomach, we go through the small intestine, the longest portion, percentage-wise, of the GI tract. Then the large intestine, which is large in terms of width, not length, which is right here. Most of it is known as the colon. And then you get into the rectum and the anus. So we're going to start with the oral cavity, the mouth. The starting of the chemical digestion of food is definitely due to salivary glands. Even just seeing food on television or seeing a picture of food, smelling food is going to initiate salivation. And you have 3 pairs of salivary glands for a total of 6. The parotid glands are in this region, in the kind of sides of the cheeks. The sublingual, that literally means under the tongue. We see those, some people can lift up their tongue and you can see these little holes and they squirt like little hoses. Those are the sublingual, under the tongue, salivary glands. And then submandibular, which are deeper and associated more with the mandible. There's this mandibular groove that's next to the back of the teeth where these particular salivary glands are rooted. And actually the majority of saliva comes from the submandibular glands and the rest of it from the parotid and sublingual. So of course salivary glands release saliva. So what's in saliva? Well, the vast majority of it is water, but what's the other 0.6%? You're looking at enzymes, antibodies, even white blood cells on occasion. But the enzymes are really what we're going to focus on. Amylase, salivary amylase is what we would call it, is one of the main ones. That breaks down larger carbohydrates into tinier ones like glucose, galactose, those monosaccharides. Lysozyme is an enzyme that actually helps keep the bacterial populations in your mouth at acceptable levels. Everyone has bacteria in their mouth. Even, using a really good mouthwash, you're not going to get rid of all of them. It's important to have some bacteria in your mouth. That's normal, but you don't want them to get out of control. Out of control bacteria is going to lead to infections like gingivitis, tooth decay, periodontal disease, things like that. So I misspoke. Lysozyme is an enzyme that helps keep that bacterial population in check. Your tongue has a lot to do with, of course, getting the food swallowed and to help break it down. As you chew, your tongue is a very strong set of muscles that work together. And I mean, over time, your tongue is so strong that you can actually end up moving your teeth in the long run if your tongue keeps pushing on them. Yes, the teeth have a lot to do with mechanical digestion, the physical breaking down of food products. Teeth are not technically bones. Their structure is a bit different than the bones of the body. I'm going to cover that in the next slide. And then last, the hard palate and soft palate. In this particular image, this sagittal cross-section straight through here, there's a little bit of German in this image, but here's the hard palate right here. That's a lot of it is actually the maxillary bones and the palatine bones. And then if you go posterior to there, you've got the soft palate, where that uvula hangs, that thing that looks like a little punching bag in the back of your mouth. The soft palate has a lot to do with swallowing, which we're going to get to in a bit. Teeth. So first we're going to start off with the anatomy of teeth. I'm going to start by mentioning dentin, and I'm going to erase, one sec, this right here. Because this image says dentine, but you actually see the word dentin much more often. So dentin is a lot of the mass of a tooth, and that is not quite on the superficial level like enamel. It's a bit deeper. Dentin is similar to bone, but the reason why you wouldn't consider it bone is, unlike your skeletal bones, there are no cells in dentin. There are, if you look at any bone of the body, there are cells that help regulate what's going on in your bones and help produce additional bone matrix over time. But dentin doesn't have cells in it. Superficial to dentin, you have what's called enamel. Enamel is the hardest biological substance in the human body. There's nothing else in your body that is harder than this. And that's important for protecting the outside of your tooth. Not just the mechanical wear and tear on teeth, but the acidic substances that enter your mouth. If it wasn't for the enamel, you'd be getting much more of a wearing away of these tissues deeper in the tooth. Over time, enamel can wear away. Eating too much acidic food, chewing on things that are way too hard too often can damage your enamel. I've actually lost some enamel in my teeth because I tend to grind my teeth in my sleep. I don't do it as much as I used to. I wear a mouth guard now, but over time, that's additional wear and tear that you don't want. Deeper to the dentin is where you get into the pulp layer, and the pulp is where you're going to find the nerves associated with teeth and blood flow into the tooth. So as you can see, there are tiny little arteries and veins, capillaries associated with each tooth, and there's also nerves associated with the pulp. And yes, here are the roots of the teeth. Depending on what tooth we're looking at, the amounts of roots can vary. Some teeth only have one root, some have 3 or even 4 roots. Cementum is a structure that helps keep the tooth anchored in the gum, or the gingiva is the other term for the gums. So if it wasn't for cementum, the chances of losing an adult tooth would be drastically increased. So thank you to cementum, which is kind of like cementing the tooth in place. And yeah, here is the bone that the tooth is anchored in. So that bone is either going to be the mandible or the maxillary bones. And yes, there are nerves associated with every tooth as well. The crown is what emerges out from the gum of the tooth. And yes, when you look at like teeth in a baby versus teeth in an adult, babies get their deciduous teeth, also called milk teeth or baby teeth, depending on who you talk to. Deciduous means falling out, like deciduous trees lose their leaves in the fall. Same meaning. So yes, those baby teeth are supposed to fall out. They typically start falling out by the time you're 7 or 8 years old, and they can keep falling out in through high school or higher grades. Even some adult people still have deciduous teeth. That's not that common, but you tend to get around 20 deciduous teeth. That can vary slightly depending on the person, but 20 is about average. By the time you're an adult and you've lost all the deciduous teeth and you've gained your what are supposed to be permanent adult teeth, you should have 32. Now that number can vary as well because I no longer have 32 adult teeth. I actually got some of my teeth removed, which I'm going to get to in a moment. Incisors are the ones that are right up front here. So 4 incisors, the 2 big ones here and the 2 that are right under them. Incisors tend to have 1 root. And they tend to have that structure that's kind of broad and flat. And so when you bite on something that you're sticking in your mouth, incisors are going to be the first to make contact typically. Cuspids, also known as canine teeth, you have a total of 4 of them, if you count top and bottom. They're right on the sides of the incisors. My canines, not as sharp as they used to be because, like I told you about grinding my teeth, that literally wore away the sharpness of my canines. And some people's canines are sharper than others. These also tend to have 1 root. Bicuspids, a little further, not quite to the molars, but bicuspids have 2 cusps, meaning when you look at the surface of them, it looks like they have 2 points instead of 1 point like on a canine. Bicuspids can have kind of a double root like this. And then molars, all the way in the back on the top and bottom. The molars, those tend to have numerous points. They tend to be broader, more for grinding of plant material. And if you compare different animals in the animal kingdom, an animal like, let's say a giraffe, which eats plant material its whole life, you're going to see teeth in its jaw that resemble our molars, but they're going to be kind of the whole surface. Yes, in the very front of a giraffe's mouth, you will have teeth that resemble the front of ours, but the majority of their teeth are meant for grinding, that plant material. But then you look at something like a canine, a dog, it's no coincidence that they're called that because they have much more sharper teeth for tearing flesh because, they tend to hunt and kill live animals. We are meant to be omnivores, omnivorous, meaning eating animal materials and plant materials instead of one or the other. And that's why we have that variety as humans. We have some sharp teeth and some flatter, broader teeth for both kinds of foods. Now, when I said that I don't have 32 teeth anymore, I got all 4 of my wisdom teeth removed. And that's a term for teeth in the back. Some people don't get all 4. Some people are born with less. It's just a genetic factor, maybe having something to do with the development in the womb, in utero as well. But my wisdom teeth, as they were coming in when I was in early high school, I was probably about 15, they were impacted, meaning as my wisdom teeth were coming in, the last of my adult teeth, they were pushing against the other teeth. So let's say this is a molar that was not quite in the back, and here's the gum line. Here's the gum line, and then there'd be another tooth over here. But the back part, the more posterior portion of my jaw, had a tooth that wanted to grow in this way, like it was pushing on my molars. And so the dentist said, hey, if we let this continue its path, over time they're going to keep pushing on those molars that are closer to the front and cause you a lot of pain, discomfort, and can actually disrupt the placement of your teeth. So they went in and removed all 4. So I actually have 28 adult teeth instead of 32. When it comes to swallowing, there are 4 main contributors to the action of getting food that you've been chewing up and salivating on back into your pharynx and esophagus. So the tongue, major contributor. If you look at what happens in this sequence, in this sort of sagittal depiction, you can see that this is the tongue here. And the tongue, as you swallow, it tends to brush up on the palate, mostly the hard palate, and push backwards. So swallow right now, and you'll see what I'm talking about. Pay attention to what your tongue's doing. So I just felt it do that. It just kind of brushed back, and it makes this action that physically pushes that bunch of food that you've been eating or the liquid you've just put in your mouth back down your pharynx. The pharyngeal muscles, as you swallow, you can feel that there are muscles located in here that also tend to move parts like the soft palate and the epiglottis. So the soft palate is right back here. You can see that it does move as you push a bolus of food backwards. The soft palate kind of kicks up to provide that clump of food. It's called a bolus, B-O-L-U-S, to move back. The epiglottis also makes an action. Every time you swallow, you can feel your larynx kind of arch up and back. The epiglottis, this little flap right here, closes on top of the glottis, and you can see that here. If it wasn't for this epiglottis closing, this food bolus could potentially go through the glottis and into the larynx and trachea. That would be no good. You want it to go through that posterior passageway, the esophagus, down into the stomach. Speaking of esophagus, here they label upper esophageal sphincter. That's the kind of muscular doorway to the top of the esophagus. In British English, there's an O in front of esophagus. In American English, there isn't. One of the many differences between those two forms of English. But this is the step-by-step process that happens when you swallow a chunk of food. And you notice that once that food has gone past the glottis, once that swallowing action is over, the epiglottis will come back up, allowing you to breathe adequately in and out until you swallow again. And the amount of time it takes for food to get all the way down the esophagus and the stomach, about 9 seconds. It certainly depends, but that's an average. When we look at the esophagus here is a hollow muscular tube, approximately 25 centimeters long, and at its widest portion, about 2 centimeters wide. Moves food into the stomach through peristalsis. Peristalsis in general is a wave-like muscular contractions. So any tube that has a muscular lining that needs to move something through it in your body, and it's usually not conscious voluntary control. It's sort of an unconscious thing, involuntary, that moves food through, or in other cases, when we look at the internal female anatomy, peristalsis happens in the fallopian tubes to help move an egg through to eventually meet sperm. But in this case, we're talking about moving food from after the swallowing action down to the stomach. Once you swallow, your voluntary control is done, right? I can't physically move it faster down my esophagus or physically move it into my stomach more quickly. It happens naturally. So that action is called peristalsis. And there are these wave-like muscular contractions that move food down. No absorption happens in the esophagus. Yes, items are secreted. There are lubricating secretions into the lumen, the space in the esophagus, to help ease food down. But you do not do absorption of nutrients here. The first place that happens is actually in the stomach, and then further down. The major layers, in general, when we look at the digestive tract, there are 4 major layers. You see 3 significant layers here, and I'll mention the 4th layer in a moment. But the innermost layer, or deepest layer of the esophagus, is the mucosa. So think of mucus, that's secreting stuff. That's in the innermost part. So the mucosa layer, deepest. Submucosa, just superficial to that. It's a supporting layer for the mucosa. The submucosa oftentimes is going to have blood flow in there, lymphatic tissue as well, which has to do with protection, the immune response. And then the muscular layers are superficial to that. And without that muscular layer, you're not going to get that peristalsis happen to move food and liquids down. There's an additional layer when you look at the stomach and further on down the GI tract. It's called the serosa. The serosa is absent from the esophagus. You don't see a significant serosa there, but the adventitia, that layer of tissue on the superficial most part of the esophagus, does have connective tissue that anchors it to the dorsal body wall. So the esophagus is really close to your back. It's close to the spinal column. The vertebrae of your spine. You want to keep your esophagus anchored. You don't want to have it moving around within your body. You want it staying put. So in general, serosa in the other parts of the digestive tract allow connection of those organs to the organs around them, and also provides stability for the outer part of the organ. So once you have food and liquid exiting the esophagus, it's going to go into the stomach. Right here at the top is something called the lower esophageal sphincter. It's the lower part of the esophagus, and a sphincter is a muscular doorway into the stomach. It's not very tight. In some animals, it's much tighter. I've heard that in horses, that sphincter there is very tight and they're unable to vomit. You want it to be tight enough to keep, the food you're digesting in the stomach, but if you've eaten something that is not good for your body or too much of something, your body sometimes has a need to expel it. And I'll talk more about that vomiting reflex in a bit. But in general, the stomach is a J-shaped organ meant for storage of food, temporarily, mechanical and chemical breakdown, and emptying of chyme into the small intestine. Chyme is a mixture of gastric juice produced in the stomach and your partially digested food. A lot of digestion happens in the stomach. It can happen further on down as well. So chyme is exiting the stomach into the small intestine on a daily basis. In terms of mechanical and chemical breakdown, remember, mechanical is the physical movement that mashes or crushes something. The stomach is filled with muscles that churn, and your stomach does that without you having to think about it. Of course, a lot of chemical breakdown happens in the stomach as well through gastric secretions, and that word gastric always means stomach. 4 layers, like I mentioned earlier: mucosa, most deep layer where that mucus is coming from; submucosa, the supporting layer just superficial to that, that's going to have the blood flow and lymphatic access, and also nerves going in there. The muscular layers, of course, those are connected to nerves, because without stimulation of the muscles to contract, they're not going to move. You actually have 3 different orientations of muscles. You have circular muscles, longitudinal muscles, oblique muscles wrapped around the stomach in various ways that maximize the ability of it to churn. The serosa is the outermost layer on the outside, the most superficial layer that's protective and helping to anchor the stomach in place. The stomach is slightly to your left. People oftentimes touch this part of their abdominal area. They're really touching where their abdominal muscles are and where it's mostly small intestine bundled up. The stomach is actually superior to that and slightly lateral, slightly off to the left. Your liver is slightly to the right. The 4 regions of the stomach: cardia, fundus, body, and pylorus. You can see the labels here in this image from Gray's Anatomy. The cardiac portion has to do with the area of the stomach that's adjacent to that esophageal opening. The fundus is the part of the stomach that actually lies just superior to that opening. The body is this area in here. That's where food tends to rest, where chyme is going to be built up, a very acidic mixture of gastric juice and partially digested food. And the pylorus is the part of the stomach that leads to the pyloric sphincter, which is the opening into the small intestine. One more thing I want to mention before moving on is the pyloric sphincter, its closing and opening is very important, because having food stay in the stomach not only is good for breaking it down further and making it easier for your small intestine to break it down and absorb, but also a disorder has been discovered in certain people who tend to become obese. And the small percentage of the population, they have a disorder where their pyloric sphincter is too loose. It lets food exit the stomach too quickly. You want food to stay in the stomach for a little while because there's a signal that goes to your brain that says, hey, we've eaten enough, we can stop eating for now. This meal is over, effectively. But if food is exiting the stomach out through the pyloric sphincter too quickly, your brain doesn't have time to get that signal, and these people tend to overeat. So an operation that tightens the pyloric sphincter can actually help them better regulate their appetite. So that's an interesting little discovery pertaining to the pyloric sphincter and the tendency to become obese. I just mentioned this about the lower esophageal sphincter right here. Sorry, my bad, I mixed it up. The lower esophageal sphincter is right there at the bottom of the esophagus, and here is the pyloric sphincter. My bad. Pyloric sphincter, right here, and the lower esophageal sphincter up top is going to be right here. That doorway into the stomach, and here's the doorway out of the stomach. If you look carefully in the mucosa layer of the stomach on the inside, there are these little folds called rugae. These folds increase the surface area within the lumen or the space of the stomach. Just like in other parts of the body where you see increased surface area, more tissue means more absorption, more secretion. So having all these rugae maximize the ability of the stomach to release gastric juice for digestion. Also, as the stomach expands, the more food you put in it, the rugae, when they stretch out, that allows, greater expansion of the stomach with ease. Gastric pits are these little holes in the rugae where you're going to get gastric secretions. And in those pits, you find gastric glands. Two main cells, a part of these gastric glands, parietal cells and chief cells. Parietal cells have a lot to do with the release of hydrochloric acid into the lumen of the stomach. And we can call the mixture of this and other things gastric juice. The interesting thing about parietal cells is if they produced and made hydrochloric acid within the cytoplasm, within the inside of that cell, that parietal cell, that hydrochloric acid would be enough to actually physically damage the parietal cell and break it down. So interestingly enough, the parietal cells send out the H+. So remember, if you took chemistry, HCl is made of H+ and Cl-. So this particular cation and this anion together make hydrochloric acid. When they're separated, it's really not hydrochloric acid. So the parietal cells send out the H+ and the chloride ions, the Cl- separately, and then they join together once they're getting out of that gastric pit, and then together in the stomach. That hydrochloric acid has a lot to do with digestion and keeping the acidity of the stomach high. Amazingly, there's an alkaline buffer, alkaline meaning basic, the opposite of acidic, that keeps the stomach from digesting itself. So that buffer is good for the stomach not wearing away over time. And then when we look at chief cells secrete a substance known as pepsinogen, and then the pepsinogen is broken down into pepsin because of the high acidity of the hydrochloric acid. Pepsin is an important part of gastric juice for digesting proteins, getting them broken up into little bits of amino acids that are eventually going to be absorbed primarily by the small intestine. The stomach does some absorption, of course, but the main absorber doing the majority of the absorption for the digestive tract is the small intestine. Gastrin is one of those hormones that has a lot to do with the functionality of the stomach. Ghrelin is a hormone that you actually didn't read a lot about or hear a lot about in older anatomy textbooks. When I took anatomy early on in my education, I didn't hear about this ghrelin hormone, but there's more and more research these days into what this does. This is a hormone released by the stomach that tells the brain, hey, we're hungry or we're not. The more ghrelin that's released, the more the brain feels, oh, we're hungry, we need to eat. Once food enters the stomach and the stomach has expanded enough, the amount of ghrelin is reduced, and then you don't feel as hungry. After the stomach is the small intestine. It plays a key role in digestion and absorption. So there is further breakdown that happens here, but a lot of absorption going on as well. The small intestine, amazingly, if you were to stretch it out, ends up being about 18 feet long, sometimes 20 feet long in the average person. And that is longer than the tallest person who ever lived times 2. So that's amazing to think about, that there's that much intestine bundled up right here. And there's connective tissues keeping it kind of tied to itself in that little bundle. There are 3 main segments of the small intestine: the duodenum, the jejunum, and the ileum. And this is in order from this part being adjacent to the stomach to this part being adjacent to the large intestine. Once again, peristalsis, the muscular lining in the small intestine, is going to help move that chyme from the stomach all the way through that 18 feet length, eventually into the large intestine. 4 layers as before. So those 4 layers of the stomach, the mucosa, submucosa, muscular layer, and serosa, you would find those in the small intestine as well. We're going to focus on the mucosa and what that lining looks like. If you were to take a cross section through the tube of your small intestine and look down it, like you were looking down a barrel, you would see these little finger-like projections called villi. And here's the lumen, that's the space right in there, but each of these is a villus. And villi is plural. So villus, and then all of these are villi, look like little finger-like projections. And then when you zoom into one of them, so here's one of those villi, if we zoomed into the surface of one single villus, there are little tiny microvilli on each of the cells of this epithelium. So here's a layer of epithelium that goes all the way around the border, and this just further increases the surface area. I've heard that the surface area in all of your small intestine, if you were to, once again, like I mentioned with the lungs in the previous lesson, if you were to open up all of that surface area and lay it out flat like you were tiling a floor, it would be close to the square footage of a comfortable 4-bedroom home. That's amazing to think about, that that's all in your small intestine. So each of these villi have microvilli that further increase the ability to break down chemically the chyme, the digested food that's coming in, and to absorb it effectively into each of these villi. In each of the villi, and microvilli are on the border, you're going to have blood flow. Of course, blood flow coming into here. That's how you get it into your bloodstream. The nutrients enter the bloodstream and then are delivered to all the cells. And you're also going to have something called a lacteal. So this green projection, this lacteal, enables your lymphatic system, the immune system, to have access to these villi. And that's important in case something traveling through your digestive tract is harmful to you, a potential harm in terms of it containing bacteria or viruses. So this lacteal is another way that your body can defend yourself from foreign particles or pathogens that have entered your digestive tract. When you get to the end of the small intestine, and later on I'll come back to how bile factors into the small intestine in terms of breaking down fats, but when you get to the very end of the small intestine, the ileum, you reach the appendix. So you can see from this Gray's Anatomy diagram, here's the ileum. This is the end of the small intestine. Here's the entrance into the colon or the large intestine. And right here, something called the vermiform process or vermiform appendix. Vermiform means worm-like, and it does kind of look like a little worm. The appendix is a small worm-like sac located near the opening into the colon, large intestine, and it's a vestigial structure. If you took biology, you know that a vestigial structure is kind of like a remnant of some part from an ancestor that is reduced in size and it's of less importance, and sometimes it's completely useless. There are different theories about how useful the appendix is. The best theory I've heard is that we still have this left over from one of our ancestors from millions of years ago. If you look back at the anthropological record, if you were to ask a paleoanthropologist, somebody who specializes in the fossils of human ancestors, they'll tell you that some of the ancestors dating back millions of years ago did not eat cooked meat. They ate, of course, vegetation, but they also ate animal tissue without cooking it. And you're introducing a lot more bacteria into your body by not cooking animal meat. They think that this particular sac was a bit larger in those ancestors, and that was conducive or helpful to the process of digesting that raw meat. And over time, when our ancestors finally started cooking meat, that changes the proteins in terms of like breaking down some of that stuff prior to putting it in your body, prior to ingesting it. And that heat also kills off all the bacteria. So we think that the size of this has gradually been reduced over millions of years. And maybe one day in our descendants, it could be gone. It's hard to say how long it will take for that to happen. But the interesting thing is that when you do get it removed because of an infection, many doctors will caution the person and say, hey, now that we've removed your appendix, it's a good idea that you don't eat sushi right away, or be careful with introducing raw animal tissues, because you're a little bit more sensitive when you're missing your appendix. Now, that might hit people differently depending on who the person is. But an appendicitis is an infection of the appendix. Too much bacteria inside of there can cause it to swell and get inflamed to the point where it pops, it bursts, and that could kill a person. An appendectomy is the removal of the appendix. And since it's vestigial, since it's typically not needed, there's no harm in removing the appendix. The large intestine begins right here, and it kind of loops around where the small intestine is located, right in the middle here. It includes the cecum, which is this initial part right here, and then the colon segments. It's for the reabsorption of water. It really makes your feces, your waste, solid. And hey, that's why I say here, formation of solid feces is the primary function, because when you get diarrhea, that means that your large intestine is not doing the job it should be doing of sucking water out of the lumen and making feces solid. Diarrhea is excessively watery feces. It's uncomfortable. You don't feel good. And that's usually because some bacteria or virus is inhibiting your large intestine's ability to do its job. Beyond that, other nutrients are absorbed in the large intestine. So it's not just absorbing water out of it. Some nutrients are absorbed in the large intestine, but far less than in the stomach and the small intestine. The four regions are the ascending colon. So since this is rising up on the right side of your body, ascending. Transverse, it goes across horizontally, right under where the liver is and the stomach. The descending colon right here, it descends, it physically moves down. And as you move through these segments, more and more water has been sucked out of it, at least that's what's supposed to happen, to the point where when you get to the sigmoid colon, kind of this S-shaped curve, by the time you get to the rectum, where feces is stored, hopefully it's solid feces ready for excretion. So the rectum and anus. The rectum is that last 15 centimeters of the digestive tract right in here. Here's that sigmoid colon. And it's for storage of feces. Storage of feces, in terms of evolution, dates back to having a planned, intentional disposal of your feces in certain areas to mark your territory. And also, you don't want to be constantly letting go of waste, because a predator who's trying to hunt you will better be able to track you. So the timed elimination and control of when feces is released dates back to that. So the storage of feces happens in the rectum, and eventually you get down to the anus, that muscular doorway where feces is expelled through. So yes, the anus, exit of feces happens there. There's two anal sphincters, two sets of muscular doorways. The internal anal sphincter, a little bit deeper in terms of being internal in your body, is involuntary. You have no conscious control over it. So as the rectum fills up, you're going to get a loosening or relaxing of that internal anal sphincter in response to the crowding of feces in this area, because once it gets too full, time to let it go. You do have control over your external anal sphincter. So when someone is, actively, trying to hold in feces, they are contracting the external anal sphincter, and the relaxing of that is going to obviously let feces through. Hemorrhoids happen when there's too much irritation of the blood vessels that are around the rectum and the anal region, and that causes dilation or swelling of those blood vessels. And as hard feces move past them, or as they're pushed past forcefully, it causes bleeding. So these enlarged blood vessels bleeding, not very comfortable, not very healthy in the long run. The way that you can minimize the occurrence of hemorrhoids and bleeding in that region, get a lot of fiber in your diet. Fiber helps keep your feces a little softer. Really hard feces tend to happen when you don't eat as much plant products, when you don't eat as much fiber rather, and the meat content of your diet a little too high. That leads to really hard feces, which rub on these walls much more. Also, drinking more water is going to help, and not pushing when you're on the toilet. Pushing on the toilet is going to irritate the walls of this part of the digestive tract, make it more likely that you're going to develop hemorrhoids and that bleeding will happen. Oh, by the way, hemorrhoids can be removed surgically, but that's typically not done unless they're really, really severe. If you do have hemorrhoids, see a doctor. They will test to make sure that that's all it is, that it's just hemorrhoids, because blood in your stool, in your fecal matter in the toilet, could be a sign of colon cancer. So definitely get that checked out. They'll do a colonoscopy, which is where they actually move a camera up through the large intestine to see if there are growths, polyps, and they'll take tissue samples of them to see if they are cancerous. So now that we've covered the digestive tract, the GI tract or alimentary canal, we're going to talk about the accessory organs that are kind of off to the side but are very important in digestion. The liver is one of them, the gallbladder tucked right underneath it, this little green sac, and the pancreas, kind of hidden in this image because it's a little bit behind the stomach, a little bit behind the large intestine, but there it is right there, that yellow organ. So the liver, this is the first slide on the liver. It is the largest visceral or internal body organ. The largest one would be the skin, but a significant sized organ, slightly off to the right side of the superior part of your abdominal cavity. 2 lobes. Here's one. The larger one is on the right, and this one a little bit more centrally located. They are separated by the falciform ligament. It's like a white band in between the 2 deep, dark, reddish portions of the liver. One of the reasons the liver is such a deep, dark red organ is the high amount of blood flow. Lots of blood flow to the liver all throughout the day. If you take all the blood out of a liver and look at that organ from a dead body, it still has a reddish purplish tone, but when it's in a living being, very red as an organ. About 25% of your blood at any given moment could be in the liver. Hepatocytes are liver cells. That word hepato, always pertains to the liver, and they're located within lobules. If you take a cross-section of the liver and look at what's in it with a microscope, there are these little round regions called lobules, and then in there you have hepatocytes, you have lots of blood vessels, you have lymphatic tissue in these little clusters, and that's how the liver is arranged microscopically. The major functions of the liver. It's no coincidence it's called the liver. Without it, you're not gonna live. It has many, many functions. Carbohydrate, lipid, and amino acid metabolism. So it assists with the breaking down of all of these macromolecules, all these different organic molecules that you eat on a daily basis, and it also has to do with the storage of glycogen. So your glucose levels in the bloodstream have a lot to do with the action of your liver. Glycogen is a large polysaccharide. It's like analogous to starch in plants. So starch is how plants typically store sugars. We store it as glycogen. And if you haven't eaten in a long time, or maybe you've gone for a long run, your blood sugar levels might be low. So your liver is stimulated to break down glycogen in individual little glucoses that are sent into the bloodstream. You also do store some glycogen in your muscles, but there's a lot of it in your liver. You also do store lipids over time. One way that you can get too much lipid storage in your liver is abuse of alcohol over time can lead to developing a fatty liver. The liver will actually get enlarged and take on a whitish appearance because of excess lipid storage. And in the long run, that enlarged liver could eventually get really bad and lead to cirrhosis, which I'm going to get to in a bit. Waste product removal. The removal of waste from your bloodstream happens significantly in the liver. Bile production. Bile, which I'll talk about more in a bit with the gallbladder, has to do with the emulsification of fats, breaking down fats into tinier bits that make it easier for enzymes to break them down and absorb them. Vitamin storage, A, B, K, B12, these vitamins are stored in the liver. Yes, you need to consume those in your diet. That's a matter of keeping yourself healthy. If you don't get enough in your diet, you're going to be releasing them out of the liver to supplement your cells with those particular vitamins. Breakdown of drugs, alcohol, drugs, whether legal or illegal, your liver is breaking them down. The reason why some medications that are prescribed need to be taken once a day or 4 times a day, it has to do with the speed at which the liver breaks down the drug. My dad worked for a company, a pharmaceutical company, that figured out if they just added a certain molecular component to the drug they had already made, it would slow down the liver's ability to get rid of it, to physically break it down and eliminate it through waste in the body. So yeah, just adding that little molecular component made it so that you only had to give 1 injection of this drug, per week instead of once a day or multiple times a day. So the liver has its own pace with how it breaks down alcohol, with how it breaks down drugs, and that has a lot to do with genetic factors and tolerance of the drug over time. More on the liver, phagocytosis and antigen presentation. So this is part of your liver's ability to assist with your immune system. Phagocytosis, not just of foreign bodies that are coming into the liver through the blood flow in the liver, but also swallowing up red blood cells that are damaged, the phagocytosis or eating of red blood cells and breaking them down. And your liver assists with presenting antigens, usually protein components on the surface of foreign invaders or pathogens to assist with your immune system's ability to kill those things. Synthesis of plasma proteins. So yes, blood cells are made typically in the bone marrow, but a lot of the proteins that end up in the fluid of your blood produced in the liver. Removal of hormones. So hormones are released from all different endocrine glands throughout the body, but your liver has a lot to do with taking in excess adrenaline, insulin, and removal of those hormones from the body when they're no longer needed. Removal of antibodies. Antibodies are supposed to be in your bloodstream at certain times, and then other times they're removed. And antibodies allow white blood cells to adequately and efficiently attack foreign invaders. So antibodies, the amazing thing is when your liver takes them in to remove them from your bloodstream, your liver can break down the antibodies into individual amino acids because antibodies are made of protein, and then your liver can reuse those amino acids to make other proteins, for instance, plasma proteins, so they can recycle those little bits. Like I mentioned earlier, the removal of red blood cells, very important. The breakdown of those red blood cells is going to lead to the formation of bilirubin, which has been discussed in another lesson that I went over. And then the removal, storage of toxins. Stuff in your bloodstream that doesn't belong there, toxic substances, your liver is going to be able to remove that. One example is hydrogen peroxide. There's so many things your liver can remove, but hydrogen peroxide is broken down by an enzyme called catalase. And the liver of every living being, not just humans, contains catalase, the enzyme that breaks down H2O2. Next, the gallbladder. Gallbladder stores bile. So the liver produces bile and then sends it to the gallbladder. And that is located just inferior to the liver. So here is an inferior view from underneath the liver. You can see that there are these hepatic veins. Remember, hepatic means of the liver. These veins that are helping to take blood from the liver to go back to the heart. And here's the inferior vena cava. That's the major vein that's going back to the right atrium. The common hepatic duct is what's going to take bile from the liver to the gallbladder, and then the common bile duct connects the gallbladder to the duodenum, or the duodenum. The duodenum is that first part of the small intestine, which you're going to get a better view of when I show you the pancreas slide. If it wasn't for that common bile duct, you wouldn't be getting bile into the small intestine. And that bile is made from a lot of different sources. One of the sources is cholesterol. It contains a variety of things like bile salts. And the bile in general, like I said earlier, emulsifies fats. So the emulsification of fats is a fancy term for breaking down lipids into smaller bits that make it easier for enzymes to further break them down into tiny chemical bits for absorption into the small intestine. So that bile helps break down fats big time. And you're going to get a lot of bile in the duodenum. You produce something like 1 liter of bile per day on average. And that bile can creep up into the stomach because the duodenum is right next to it. And bile can also be found further down the line in the small intestine. Bile can also be reabsorbed from the intestines, and it can actually go back to the liver and can be recycled throughout the day. Some people do get their gallbladder removed. I'm going to talk more about gallstones. The reason why you don't need a gallbladder is as long as the common hepatic duct is still connected through the bile duct that takes it to the duodenum, you do not need that temporary holding sac for the bile. So I know people who've had their gallbladder removed, but their liver's still producing it and still sending it down into the small intestine. The pancreas. This is an endocrine organ. It has a lot to do with hormones, but it also is a definite part of the digestive system. It lies posterior, just behind the stomach, in between the duodenum and the spleen, which is a lymphatic organ, part of your immune system. It's about 15 centimeters long, it's pinkish gray, and it's got a body and a tail. So here's the body of the pancreas. The tail is kind of that tapered part that's closer to the left side of your body. But you can see, hey, here's the duodenum, the beginning of the small intestine. Your spleen would be right over here. It produces digestive enzymes and buffers. So here are some examples of the enzymes that are produced and sent out through the pancreatic duct. You can see that this connects to the duodenum just like the bile duct connects to the duodenum. Pancreatic alpha amylase. This is very similar to salivary amylase in your saliva. This helps break down sugars. Pancreatic lipase, named after the fact that it helps break down fats. Nucleases are enzymes that break down DNA and RNA because when you're consuming plants or animal products, they have DNA and RNA too. And the proteolytic enzymes, also known as proteases, that's one of the main kinds of these enzymes, they help break down proteins. So some digestive conditions and disorders. Gastritis is an irritation or infection of the stomach. It is curable. Antibiotics can help with that, of course. Ulcers. Ulcers, it doesn't just happen in the stomach. They can happen in various parts of the digestive tract. It's a wearing away of the lining. It can be very painful, and there can be even some internal bleeding. There was this myth years ago that stress caused ulcers. Stress can lower the effectiveness of your immune system, and that can make an ulcer more likely to happen. But it's not the direct cause. There actually is a kind of bacterium that's been linked to the causing of ulcers. And it's pylori. Pylori is in the name. I'll post later on about the specific name of it, but there is a kind of bacterium that is the root of causing ulcers, and antibiotics can get rid of it. Gallstones. Oh, it's H. pylori. I just remembered it. H. pylori. That causes ulcers. Gallstones. If there is a inability of getting bile salts out of the gallbladder and into the small intestine effectively, you get this backup, and the buildup of the bile salts leads to the formation of stones. This is a gallbladder that's been taken out of a person's body. You can see they're literally stones, hard deposits that's caused this backup. So this person is still able to get bile out of their liver to the small intestine, but this needed to be removed. The backup and inability of bile to go from the liver to the small intestine can be a problem. Cholera is an infection that causes massive diarrhea and massive fluid loss. This, in the past, killed much more people, many more people, because the discovery of antibiotics and getting rid of the bacteria that can cause cholera has saved many lives. But cholera, if untreated, can dehydrate a person so much that it kills them. Hepatitis is an infection of the liver. Hepatitis A, B, C, D, or E. A is the least harmful type, typically, but hepatitis in general, infections of the liver, can be deadly because the liver is an organ that's very important. Jaundice. The inability of the liver to regulate the amount of bilirubin in the bloodstream can lead to jaundice. So when this bilirubin molecule is throughout the body way too much, the buildup of it in the skin and even in the eyes causes this yellowish kind of appearance. And you could see from this particular image, this guy, his scleras are even yellow, the whites of his eyes. And yeah, depending on your skin tone, the yellowness or yellowishness of the skin is going to be more apparent. I found that my aunt, who's a nurse in a neonatal unit in a hospital, she said that babies who have jaundice right after they're born, they found that if they put heat lamps on them, that actually can help get rid of jaundice fairly quickly, actually. So jaundice is something that is curable, but the yellowness, not very pleasant. Cirrhosis is liver disease. That's a liver that has been damaged over time by too many toxins, drug abuse, alcohol abuse over time causes cirrhosis. If you don't get a liver transplant, cirrhosis is deadly. Constipation is having feces that is just way too solid and too rough, and that backup and solid balls of fecal matter causes a backup, and it's hard to physically push it out. Like I mentioned earlier with hemorrhoids, getting more fiber, more plant material in your diet, whole grains, more water in your diet, and lessening the amount of meat intake can actually help a lot with constipation. Diarrhea, like I mentioned with the large intestine before, is a virus or bacterium that has inhibited your large intestine's ability to reabsorb water, and that excess water in your fecal matter is going to cause diarrhea. Lactose intolerance. There are genetic links to lactose intolerance where the amount of lactase, the enzyme that breaks down lactose in dairy products, is just not as high in certain people as it is in others. I have no problem digesting lactose. I can eat a lot of cheese or ice cream and I feel fine. I don't notice any negative effects when I go to the bathroom, but some people do. Some people, it just takes a little bit of cheese, ice cream, or milk, and then they have that uncomfortable sensation in their GI tract, and then they notice trouble on the toilet with that. There are medications that can assist your body's ability to break down lactose. There are pills that you can take to help with lactose intolerance. And then gingivitis, the gum disease known as gingivitis, is a gum infection. The gingiva is a technical term for your gums. So not brushing your teeth adequately, not flossing, can lead to gingivitis. Periodontal disease is another example of a disease that's going to impact your teeth, and you're more likely to lose your teeth if that's untreated. Brushing your teeth twice a day and using floss is going to minimize the chances of getting gingivitis. You don't want to get that. It's going to give you typically really bad breath, a very unattractive appearance in terms of your oral health. And this is actually, from what I've heard, the most common bacterial infection on planet Earth. Because if you look at populations around the globe, various people are not keeping their mouth as clean as they could. They may not have access to a toothbrush or toothpaste or dental care. So gingivitis, a very common mouth infection and very common bacterial infection in general. Thanks for watching Educator.com.